Thank you for joining us today. This is Insightful Leader Live. I'm Jess Love, Editor-in-Chief of Kellogg Insight, host of our podcast, The Insightful Leader. Please tune in again on December 2nd. We're going to be hearing from Professor Lee Thompson about how to navigate work relationships in this exceedingly virtual world. Today, I will be talking with Professor Meghan Busse about what it will take to get us to a carbon neutral future. But before we get started, a little bit of housekeeping. Right now, everyone is using the chat function to tell us where you're from. I love to see it. However, we will be shutting that functionality down. Instead, we want to refer you to the Q&A box. We're going to leave plenty of time for questions for Professor Busse, and go ahead and enter all of those in there. And feel free to upvote other questions if they resonate with you. Closed captioning is available. You can access it via live transcript in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. And this event will be recorded. Everyone who registered will get a link to the video of this presentation. All right, heat waves, droughts, wildfires, downpours, flooding, hurricanes. I'm in the Midwest right now. I'm going to say derechos. The climate is warming and weather is becoming more extreme and less predictable. Increasingly, businesses and other organizations are understanding this isn't a problem for later. It's a problem right now, and it's getting worse every year. So what can we do about it? What is it still possible for us to do? Professor Meghan Busse is an associate professor of strategy at Kellogg. She's also an expert in the economics of energy markets. And today, I'm really excited. She's going to walk us through what a transition to carbon neutrality might look like, where we are in that process right now, and what role businesses can play. So she's going to start with a presentation, but we are going to leave plenty of time for Q&A. So please put your questions in the Q&A box. All right, I'm going to turn it over to you, Professor Busse.
Thanks very much, Jess. Let me pull the presentation up. Good. Jess, can you tell me, is everyone seeing that the way they should?
Looks great to me.
Perfect. I want to say a special hello to all of my former students. And I want to say, I think maybe an extra special hello to those of you who aren't my former students and who tuned in anyway. I'm really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you a little bit about climate change and about what it means to get to a zero carbon future. So what I'd like to start with is a question that a student of mine actually asked me last year. So my impression, being somebody who studies climate change, is that a lot of people who don't find it to be kind of an overwhelming topic. There's a lot of science, there's a lot of politics, and in fact, there's sort of a lot of emotion. This can be a frightening and depressing topic that people aren't sure quite how to engage with. And I think that was what was behind a student of mine last year who asked me, "How long do we have?" she said. And I think what she meant by that was, how long do we have to stop climate change? The IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change of the UN, published a report in August of this year. And the answer of the IPCC to this question was a sobering one. We don't have any time. We don't have any time anymore. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to go over, there's an excellent summary report for policymakers. It's not the full technical report that I've sort of cited here at the bottom, and you can access, the link's going to go up where you can access that if you want. I want to go through a couple of things that report had to tell us about where we are on climate change. So that report first said, this has been some matter of some political debate, although not a matter of scientific debate, that it is really unequivocal that human influence has warmed the atmosphere, the ocean, and the land, leading to widespread changes in atmosphere, ocean, cryosphere, and biosphere. And so this graph shows you a little bit with temperatures we can measure since 1850 and temperature records that we can construct and extrapolate all the way back to, for the last 2,000 years, just how quickly our atmosphere has warmed, absolutely unprecedented relative to anything that we've seen in thousands of years before this. What else did the IPCC report tell us? It also told us that human-induced climate change is already affecting a lot of weather and climate extremes in every region across the globe, that we see these in particularly in extreme weather phenomena like heat waves, heavy precipitation, droughts, tropical cyclones, and in particular, we know their attribution to human influence has changed since the last report of the IPCC. And so this graph is a graph that gives you, for different regions of the world, how much temperature has increased, and with these dots, how confident the science is that those increases in temperatures that have been observed have to do with human influence. So that was a second conclusion. The third thing that I want to mention, and this is a really serious one, the IPCC report concluded that global surface temperature is going to continue to increase until at least the mid-century under all the emissions scenarios that they considered. What does that mean? That means that even if we cut carbon emissions, GHG emissions, dramatically and immediately, we are already committed to a path of increasing temperature, of temperature increasing enough to cause climate changes. All right, and so this graph shows you a little bit about what are predicted changes we could have in droughts versus areas of heavy precipitation if we can keep our temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is the smallest possible scientists think we could possibly keep it to, or to 2 or to 4 degrees, which would be have much more dramatic effects. All right. The last conclusion that I want to highlight is this one. Many of the changes that we are going to expect and we're experiencing due to the past and future greenhouse gas emissions are irreversible for centuries to millennia. So there's a couple of really sobering paragraphs here. The past GHG emissions since 1750 have committed the global ocean to future warming with high confidence. Based on multiple lines of evidence, we're virtually certain about upper ocean stratification, virtually certain about ocean acidification, and have high confidence in ocean deoxygenation, which is going to continue for another century. Okay, changes are irreversible on centennial to millennial timescales in ocean temperatures, we think with very high confidence, acidification and deoxygenation also. That's the oceans. How about the glaciers? Mountain polar glaciers, given the choices we've made already, are committed to continue to melting for decades or centuries with very high confidence. The loss of permafrost we're committed to is irreversible with very high confidence over centennial timescales. Continued ice loss is virtually certain for the Greenland ice sheet, likely for the Antarctic ice sheet, and there's high confidence we'll have total loss of the Greenland ice sheet if we have cumulative emissions. It sounds less dangerous, but it's not so not so confidence inspiring that there's limited evidence for the kind of low likelihood, high impact outcomes resulting from ice sheet instability that would strongly increase ice loss. Okay, so what about sea levels? It's virtually certain that global mean sea level will continue to rise over the 21st century. It's very likely to have global mean level rise in the next 100 years by 1/4 to 1/2 foot, even under the very low GHG emission scenario, and higher under higher emission scenarios. In the longer term, sea levels committed to rise for centuries to millennia due to continuing deep ocean warming. And over the next 2,000 years, we'll have sea levels rise by 2 to 3 meters if we can keep warming to the level we know we're committed to, and as much as 19 to 20 meters if we have warming of the worst that we're worried about. Okay, so that's pretty concerning. Finally, there's danger that's much harder to predict of really catastrophic outcomes like ice sheet collapse, abrupt ocean circulation changes, and some compound events when multiple of these happen at once. These are the catastrophic changes that we actually don't know the impact of because we've never seen precedents of them. If ocean currents change, if we get total loss of ice sheets, those are just not things that can easily be repaired or that we know will return. It's this kind of view of the world, I think, that, or of what the science is, that inspired Greta Thunberg already a few years ago in 2019 to say the following at the World Economic Forum. She said, "I don't want you to be hopeful. I want you to panic. I want you to feel the fear I feel every day. And then I want you to act. I want you to act as you would in a crisis. I want you to act as if the house was on fire, because it is." So this scientists have been telling us was coming for a while. It's something that in August, scientists told us we had made inevitable through choices that we have made. My sense is that climate change, as I've just been sort of living my life and watching the news, seems to have become real and salient to a lot of people in a way that it wasn't before. So Jess mentioned some of these kinds of occurrences, but you may have noticed it's been a really weird year. It's been a really weird summer. So what kinds of things have we seen, like right on the heels of each other? So we saw a flash flood warning for Manhattan, which has never had a flash flood warning before. And you know, there were people who died in basement apartments. We had flash flooding very close to the same time in Tennessee, disastrous flash flooding. The Colorado River, for the first time, declared a water shortage. That means that communities that depend on the Colorado River won't get as much money or as much water as they're expecting. You probably saw the wildfires in California and in the Pacific Northwest. Hurricane Ida hit both the Gulf Coast and the Northeast. We had a twofer. We had, within days of each other, a record set for the amount of rain in Central Park in New York, and that record broken only a few days later by Hurricane Ida. And finally, the Pacific Northwest had a heat wave of the sort that it has almost never seen, essentially never seen, which led to deaths there also. All of that in the course of a summer. And I didn't even talk about the freeze that we had in Texas in the months before that. These events seem to have called to people's attention, made it real and salient to them, that climate change means that the climate is going to change everywhere and for everyone, and with salient, meaningful, and costly consequences. All right, so having scared the living daylights out of you, perhaps, what is it that we need to do? If this is what scientists tell us is the truth about what we can expect, what is it we need to do? What scientists are telling us is that we don't have the choice that my student hoped we had, which is, can we forestall climate change? Can we stop climate change? But we still have a really important choice. The choice that we have now is whether we want the normal that this last summer represented and the worsening that the IPCC tells us we should expect. Do we want that worsening to be a little bit worse, or do we want it to be a lot worse? Because at the moment, those are our choices. And what I want to argue to you is that it's really worth it to make it not be a lot worse, and there are things we can do. And so I'd like to tell you what it is we can do. In order to think about what it is we can do, we need to know what are the levers that we have access to pull, okay? And one way to think about what levers we have to pull is to think about where greenhouse gas emissions come from. So I think of this in kind of a rough quarters, okay? I think of there being roughly a quarter that comes from transportation, roughly a quarter that comes from electricity generation, roughly a quarter that comes from industry, and a final quarter that's split roughly between commercial and residential. This is things like heating and agriculture. Okay, this is US emissions of greenhouse gases. Global emissions of greenhouse gases look a little bit different. Transportation is a smaller share of global emissions than it is in the US. We have more cars and we drive them more and we drive them farther. Agriculture and land use are a bigger share globally because there's more deforestation and crop burning that's happening outside of the US than inside the US. But many of the levers are similar levels and roughly similar sizes. All right, so what this graph tells us is that if we want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in an effort to keep to that 1.5 Celsius degree increase, the big levers we're going to need to pull are in electricity, transportation, and industrial use. So let's take a look at each one of those sections. I want to start with electricity first. So with electricity, where do we stand? Electricity has some really, really good news. The cost of renewable energy has fallen dramatically faster than anybody expected. A decade ago, we expected it would take us 50 to 100 years to have the cost of generating electricity fall as much as it has. That's terrific news. In fact, the costs of renewable generation have fallen so far that for some generation technologies like wind and like centralized, this is not on your house, but this is centralized solar, the levelized cost, which means the operating cost plus the capital cost, so the fully allocated cost, is now coming within the range of the operating cost of fossil fuels. Okay, so what does that mean? That means we are starting to get to the point where it's cheaper to install new renewables than it is to run existing fossil fuel generations. That is terrific news. Okay. And we are, in fact, seeing coal use fall off quite dramatically in the US. We are seeing renewables expand some, that's the green, although there's sort of medium good news here, which is that a lot of the decrease in coal has actually been taken up by natural gas rather than by renewables. This is a win because natural gas has about half the CO2 emissions of coal, but it's not good enough for where we need to go. All right, so what is holding us back on going farther in terms of electricity generation and in terms of making our electricity generation green? There's a couple of challenges. One challenge is that solar and wind are intermittent generation sources. We can't turn them on and off. The day turns on and off the sun, and the weather turns on and off the wind. Okay, so what this means? So they're intermittent generation. Also, the peak generation times, which happens in the middle of the day for solar and in many locations overnight for wind, doesn't align with peak demand, which creates a problem that's sometimes called the duck curve problem, because people think this curve looks like a duck. Let me show you what it is. What this shows is, at a typical day in California, solar generation, which starts in the morning as the sun comes up, peaks here in the middle of the day and falls off as the sun goes down, and then shows you what the load profile is of demand. This is the electricity that people want. It peaks here in the late afternoon as people come home from work. And what this means is we get maximum generation right here, which is not our peak demand. And the rest of the electricity system has to generate a little bit in the day and then ramp up really hard at night in order to get that evening demand. That's tricky to do with an intermittent generation source. One thing that could help us move to renewable generation in a world where we have this kind of a peak production that mismatches peak demand and gives us this duck curve is if we had storage. If we could take this electricity that we can generate here and store it to the night, or store it from cloudy days, or from sunny days to cloudy days, or store it, for an area that has a lull in the wind, that would help a lot with the intermittency problem. In order to fully move over, we're going to need both more storage, we're going to need storage to be cheaper, and we're going to need different kinds of storage than we have. So what are our challenges with current technologies? Some of them have environmental drawbacks of their own. So one form of storage is pumped storage. You literally pump water uphill when electricity is cheap and let it run downhill and generate electricity with it when electricity is expensive. That requires building dams, which have their own environmental consequences. Some kinds of storage technology are expensive and use scarce materials like lithium-ion batteries, which are being used for some utility scale storage applications, but probably cannot be deployed at the size that we would need. And some of these aren't very suitable for long-term storage. Some of them do better, like lithium-ion batteries, over a few hours than over days or weeks. This is a really active and exciting area of research with all kinds of different ideas, including gravity systems where you lift a heavy block with cheap energy and let it fall in order to generate electricity when you need it. Liquid salt, which can store solar energy, compressed air. There's a bunch of different research areas, and this is an exciting research area. The other thing we will probably need in order to be able to move fully towards renewables is more investment in the electricity grid. So the electricity grid that we have at the moment was set up and optimized to carry electricity from places where electricity was historically generated by fossil fuel sources towards current demand and load centers, we're going to need, in addition to renewables and storage, we're going to need a different transmission grid that will transmit and distribute electricity in that new configuration. All right, so that's kind of the snapshot of where we are in electricity. What on the technology of electricity, what else holds us back on electricity? There are important politics that hold us back. So fossil fuel, and coal in particular, is represented by entrenched political interests. In the US, this is driven in part by the role of Pennsylvania and Ohio in electoral politics, when you think about the Electoral College, and really crucially and saliently at the moment by the political priorities of Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia, who is our swing Democratic vote at the moment, and who, Jess, I'm sorry, I've got a little technical difficulty here for a second. There we go. Who is currently our swing senator and has strong preferences about the coal industry. Around the world, there are similar kinds of considerations. In Australia, where there's a similar political role. In India, where railroads depend on carrying coal to stay afloat. In China, where there are mismatched incentives between local party officials and China's central party. And where China has invested internationally in infrastructure that has included coal plants, and with an aversion to nuclear power in Germany and Fukushima. So it's not just uniquely in the US that coal has an important entrenched political interest, and that has made policymaking difficult. And as I mentioned earlier, in the US, part of the decline in coal has come from a transition to natural gas, which has about half the CO2 emissions of coal, but has its own drawbacks for climate, including methane leaks and the environmental consequences of fracking. So let's talk about transportation, which was the second, sort of one of the second big buckets. Where do we stand on transportation? So a lot of people are excited about transportation electrification. Electric vehicles are still a very small share of US vehicle sales, although there are companies around the world, including GM at the US, that have announced plans to be all electric sometime in the next 10 to 15 years. So that will be an exciting thing to watch. In other countries, there are both bigger share of vehicle sales that are electric and bigger numbers. Note that electric vehicles are green only if the electricity that they use, is generated in a green and environmentally friendly way. So if you are using a coal plant to generate electricity for your Tesla is not very green. So as we have increasing renewables on the grid, that will help. So there's some, we're at the beginning, but some signs of momentum in passenger vehicles. Passenger vehicles are only about 60% of road transportation, which itself is only a fraction of total transportation. Other transportation applications like freight, trucking, like shipping, and like travel by air are not nearly as easy to electrify, and those continue to be a challenge. So what holds us back? What holds us back is that fossil fuels are really hard to beat in terms of a transportation application. They are very energy dense relative to their weight, and they are very portable. We don't have a great alternative solution yet for things like freight trucking, shipping, and airplanes. One exciting possibility, although it's way on the horizon still, is green hydrogen. So green hydrogen is hydrogen that's produced by electrolysis using renewable energy. It's exciting because its byproduct is water. The problem is we don't yet know how to do this at scale or at low enough cost, but it's an area of active research, including by some big oil companies who think maybe this sort of handling of dangerous liquids under pressure is in fact something that they can be good at. And so that's kind of an exciting innovation. That I have read once about hydrogen. It is the fuel of the future and probably always will be. So that's what we're hoping to break, is to make it a real fuel, not just a fuel that we're always hoping about in the future. All right, let's talk about the last piece, which is industry and agriculture. Where do we stand? So the industries that produce the most GHG emissions are ones that are energy and heat intensive: iron and steel, cement and chemicals like ammonia production for fertilizer, petrochemicals, food and tobacco, and paper and pulp are worldwide the biggest GHG emitters. There are other ones that are sort of sneaky that you wouldn't guess. Things like Bitcoin, which is an incredibly electricity intensive industry because it's all running powerful servers. And there are some estimates that estimate that mining for Bitcoin may take almost 1% of world electricity consumption. And obviously other things that are transportation intensive. On the agricultural side, GHG emissions come primarily from livestock and manure, from fertilizer use. Rice produces a lot of methane, and then deforestation and crop burning, right? And you've heard me mention a couple of times the importance of methane. Methane is of particular concern because it has about 80 times the heat trapping effect of carbon dioxide. So finding a way to get methane, to reduce methane emissions, has really an outsized bang for the buck in terms of what it does for the climate, especially in the short term. All right, what holds us back from this on industry and agriculture? I think what holds us back is a lack of incentives. There are occasionally heartwarming win-wins, decisions that are good both for profits and good for the environment, like installing LED lighting. But the honest truth of the matter, and here you'll see that I'm an economist, the dismal science, remember, ultimately GHG reduction, it mostly increases costs, mostly without creating what most consumers feel is a tangible benefit. Some consumers are willing to pay for the knowledge that a product is green, but in many cases, consumers are not. This makes it difficult for companies to do the right thing, and even more so the more competitive their industry is, and the less they have pricing power or the ability to differentiate themselves. In some industries, there have been regulations that have collectively committed competitors to use environmentally friendly practices. In lots of industries, there aren't. And there's always the danger if politicians see advantages in opposing or rolling back environmental regulations, as we saw with methane rules under the previous administration. So what might help? So I said on this previous slide that I thought the danger was a lack of incentives. Where might industry companies get incentives in order to change their practices? Some incentives might be provided by investors. So over the last several years, I have increasingly seen headlines like this that suggest that money managers and investors want to understand the extent to which companies are exposed to climate risks and would like a better handle on putting pressure on companies to change their practices so they're less exposed. Some of this comes from activist investors who use shareholder proposals or lawsuits. We saw a successful activist investor bid at Exxon this past year. But some of it appears to come from people who are not primarily activist motivated, but are financially motivated. And this view is really articulated by the BlackRock chief, Larry Fink, in his last two annual letters, where he is really concerned about sustainability related risk. He says, I believe we're on the edge of a fundamental reshaping of finance. The evidence on climate risk is compelling investors to reassess core assumptions about modern finance. And he says this is about a fiduciary concern, not a political concern. He says further that what he wants is for BlackRock to start to look at the economic impacts of climate change, or that it has, and finds that they're already having financial effects, and that this is the issue that investors most often raise with him. In his letter in 2021, he was even more direct about this, calling on all companies to disclose a plan for how their business model is going to be compatible with a net zero economy. All right, and they're going to expect to understand how that plan is incorporated in the long-term strategy. I urge companies to move quickly to issue them rather than waiting for regulations to impose them. And in fact, some companies are, right? Starting first, as you can imagine, with the companies who are most exposed to these risks, like oil companies. Shell is an example of a company that has announced that they, as of 2019, have already reached their own peak oil, that Shell plans to every year produce less oil than they did the previous year from 2019 on. And that it is moving into other areas like hydrogen and other fuels, and similar plans from BP and Total. One of the things that will help this is to have better transparency of reporting and disclosure. So we don't really have a unified system, and we don't have a system that's mandatory. There are several different task force and initiatives to try to create this. The chief value of this is the opportunity to distinguish between what is really material, meaningful, and significant, opposed to what is called greenwashing. It's like whitewashing, trying to pretend you're doing something you're not on an environment, that doesn't have much significance on an environmental front. So will this sort of investor pressure and the recognition of companies that climate might be a financial risk to them, will this be enough to move us to net zero? I actually think it won't. And the reason I think it won't is the following. Economists like me recognize that any kind of pollution, including greenhouse gases, is a negative externality. That means there's an action taken by one party that has negative consequences, harm on another party who doesn't have any control of or say in that decision. If companies respond to climate change only to the extent that it threatens their own profits, their own private incentives, then they're not going to be doing enough. This is what we've been doing for the last 30 or 40 years, is that companies have been responding to climate change only as much as they saw it in their own incentive, and it hasn't been enough because companies don't respond very well. No human being, in fact, responds very well to consequences for people who are far away and in the future. We're just good at ignoring consequences that don't affect us directly. The only solution, therefore, I think, is a policy solution. In fact, a mix of policy solutions, a mix of carrots and sticks that will provide companies a direct financial incentives to do not only what's good for their own narrow and immediate interests, but what's necessary for protecting the future. The Biden administration clean energy standard is exactly an example of a carrot and stick approach that was meant to encourage electricity generators to adopt renewable energy. Unfortunately, that's likely to be in the process of being dropped from the infrastructure bill, sort of even as we're talking about it. What are the policies that we need? I think there are a couple of key ones. First, I would say a carbon price. We need to have a global price on carbon. We need to have it be the case that the prices that everyone pays, both companies and final consumers, for the goods and services that they choose reflects the true economic cost of producing those goods and services, including the cost of the climate. So getting the prices right would also help create the incentive to develop new net zero technologies. There's a bunch of different ways you could do this. A cap and trade system does this. A carbon tax does this. A carbon tax and dividend approach, which you can read about more in this further reading, is a great example. And a really interesting example to consider. And we need a border carbon adjustment if the scheme isn't global. I'm happy to answer questions in the Q&A if people would like to know more about these. What else do we need? Second, we need R&D incentives. Even with a global carbon price, we're going to need probably incentives to develop critical technologies before market forces will take us over. These include technologies we know we need right away, like storage, but also technologies to improve processes for the products we know we can't get by without and are currently GHG intensive, things like steel, cement, and fertilizer, which we know we're going to keep needing in the future. In the long run, we might need technologies for carbon removal from the atmosphere. At the moment, this is really expensive, and since carbon isn't very concentrated, it's not really the best way to go about it. These strategies are more important. An interesting book on this is Bill Gates' recent book, How to Avoid a Climate Disaster, where he argues why, if we eventually are going to stop the planet warming, we eventually need to go to having net zero. And the only way to do that is by having technology in addition to the carbon prices. And then the last thing we need are targeted regulations to fix the really immediate problems that we know are consequential, like regulations of methane emissions. So what should you do, leaders who've come to hear me at an Insightful Leader Talk? I think the changes that we need in global emissions aren't going to be accomplished by individuals changing their individual choices within the context we're currently operating in. Recycling might make you feel good. The things you can do inside your house might make you feel good, and you should do them, but they won't be enough. Most of the decisions that affect Carbon emissions are decisions that are made inside companies. In order for companies to act effectively on this, sustainability has to stop being a siloed function. Sustainability has to be everybody's problem. The Biden administration has announced what they call a whole of government approach to climate change. Every decision made by every department should include a consideration of climate. Companies need to do the same things. What's the most important thing you can do? I think the most important thing you can do is ask yourself, what can you influence in the public arena? That's ultimately where we need the policies. We need policies that are big enough, that can make big enough changes. They have to be made on large scale in the public arena. Who are the political candidates that you contribute to and engage with, and what do you tell them? Who are the political candidates that your company engages with and contributes to, and what do you tell them? What are the trade and industry associations that you can influence? What platforms do you have? What can you do to get the message to decision makers that you think that you are better off if we limit global temperature rise? And so those decision makers should have the incentive to do the same. Thanks so much for coming and attending, and I'm delighted to take questions.
Well, I am very glad to hear that, because we have a ton of really awesome questions. I'm going to go ahead and get started. This was a pretty popular question from our audience. A lot of the world is turning to electric vehicles and other similar technologies because of fewer emissions, but then we're left with a lot of battery waste. How big a concern is battery waste, and how can we kind of contextualize that against the emissions benefits?
That's a very good question, on which I don't have a lot of technical expertise, in fact. It is true that batteries use a lot of rare earth metals and other kinds of valuable commodities, valuable and scarce commodities. There is increasing interest in being able to recycle some of those, but that is, sort of the life cycle consequence of those and of batteries is something that I'm not sure we have adequately addressed. It's a good thing to be concerned about, and beyond my area of technical expertise, not being an engineer, to say a lot more about.
Well, we're hitting you with hard ones right off the bat. We've got a very smart, engaged audience. So I'm also getting a lot of questions about exactly what like a carbon fee would look like. So a specific one that I think is pretty interesting. Is there any consensus on like how we would actually set that global price? Like that seems like a pretty daunting challenge to say, okay, this is the price for 1 unit of carbon. How would we even go about doing that?
So there was a project inside the Obama administration to create a price for carbon, what was called the social cost of carbon. And Jess, it's not among the things that I sent you to post on the website, but I'll send you a couple of articles to post on there for folks who are interested in it.
Yeah.
So what?
Yep.
So what is tricky about this? There's a couple of things that are tricky about this. The easiest part to do is sort of estimate what are the damages associated with incremental carbon. We do that with kind of sophisticated computer models that combine a model of weather and sort of how GHGs affect weather and climate. We combine that with a model of how weather affects economic and social and health outcomes. And these models are called integrated assessment models. From that model, we can pull out a numerical estimate of what is the cost in terms of health and economic output of incremental carbon emissions. Depending on that, the model that you use, and the assumptions that you make, you'll get a figure between 20 and 40 on the low end that essentially anybody who believes in and acknowledges climate change would say the social carbon is at least that high, and something more between 50 and 100 which is what most of the policymakers that I know who really care about this and want to see us make changes would think of as the social cost of carbon. So that's actually the easiest part. What are the harder parts? The harder part is making societal trade-offs about now versus future. Many of the costs that have to be borne in order to prevent climate change from happening are costs that we have to bear now. Some of the biggest benefits are benefits in the future. And so there's sort of a social question about how we value sort of costs and benefits over the future. And there's another difficult social question about how we think about risks. Do you just want to have sort of what the expected value is of the damages that carbon emission causes? How much do you want to worry about the fact that incremental carbon emissions could potentially cause these real changes in our climate systems, potentially irreversible, dramatic, catastrophic, and compounding changes in our climate systems, like losing the Antarctic ice sheet, like fundamentally changing the deep ocean currents that are necessary to keep Europe being a temperate climate? How much are you willing to risk that? And if you want to have a price that builds in some risk aversion about the fact that climate catastrophe, like civilization threatening climate catastrophe, is something that you might want to price in and therefore choose a higher price of carbon. So that's a teeny tiny little essay about some of the issues that are important. And Jess, I'll send along more things that people can read that will articulate that for those who are interested.
Yeah, that would be great. I mean, I think if there's anything the last, let's say 2 years has taught us, it's that these kind of rare black swan type events are possible. So it's interesting that that's kind of going to be a part of setting that price at some point.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I wanted to talk to you. You talked a little bit about kind of what we need to do either as a country or internationally. And I wanted to ask you about what might need to happen or is already happening at the state and local level. Is this something that you've looked at all?
So this is a really good question. So when I was in graduate school, I lived in Somerville, Massachusetts, and the house I lived in was about 2 blocks away from the house where Tip O'Neill grew up. And Tip O'Neill was a long-term speaker of the House, a Democrat from Massachusetts, who was famous for saying that all politics is local. And I think this is sort of the ironic thing that we're seeing about climate change, which is that climate change is the ultimate global problem. But many of the decision makers who are tasked with making the decisions that we need to at larger levels have local concerns. Whether local is sort of the US thinking about its interests versus China's versus India's versus the EU, or whether local means thinking about West Virginia's concerns vis-a-vis relative to the sort of the US or the rest of the world. And I think that this is what a lot of the political challenge has been, is that different locations perceive the costs and benefits of climate change differently because they differ in what the economic basis is. Are they a coal mining region? Are they a manufacturing region? Are they a region that has lots of other options or not so many options? And also differ in how intensely they feel droughts or wildfires or hurricanes versus not, right? Here in the Midwest, Jess, we are actually pretty insulated. Most of these kinds of things, we haven't had in this crazy summer one of these terrible disasters that have affected a lot of other places. That can really alter your perception. So what needs to happen on state and local levels? So I actually hope that some of, I talked about sort of how crazy this summer has been and that climate change has become real. I hope that one of the effects that this has had actually has convinced people locally and leaders locally that these global problems come home and they cause really expensive and deadly disasters at home. This is what climate change is more extreme, less predictable things. And while it costs us something to deal with them, to sort of do the things we need to for climate change, it costs an awful lot, both in money and suffering and sometimes in human life, to respond to flash floods and hurricanes and freezes and heat waves. I was hearing this morning, just as I was coming in on the morning on the radio, a representative from the Trump administration who was talking about the current Build Back Better plan and talking about some of the climate and energy provisions in that, who was claiming that the $500 billion that is being currently asked for climate related things in that bill is about the same value as the amount that has been lost in the 22 largest natural disasters in the US over the last year, right? And so it's you know, you're talking about making a comparison that hopefully people will begin to see that the local costs of climate change are big enough that there should be local support for leaders who will work also on these larger issues.
Yeah, it is really interesting just to think about how expensive that is. I had an interesting conversation with another professor yesterday. I was mentioning I was doing this talk with you, and professor in the finance department, and he said the one thing that made him feel a little bit optimistic about climate change was just how quickly insurance markets are actually responding to some of this local variability. And he's like, that's the one thing that gives me hope right now.
I mean, you know, as we as economists believe that people respond to incentives, and the strongest and clearest way to get incentives quickly to people are with prices. The prices they have to pay for insurance, the prices they have to pay for inputs. And this is why, excuse me, this is why economists are so much a fan of carbon prices, is because only when you get the prices that embodied in the choices that people have to make to actually reflect the true trade-offs, will you give people strong enough incentives to make the trade-offs that are ultimately going to be what we need for the planet.
All right, so this is a popular one with our audience. It's not going to be an easy one. How do we balance the current need to meet energy demand with fossil fuels while we wait to bring online more renewable energy sources? And then I'll be honest, I don't fully understand the second part. So I'll just ask it. Do you see this tension as partly fueling some of the inflation we're seeing today?
So I don't know whether the question about inflation is about the general price level in the economy, or whether it's what's happening about fossil fuel prices, particularly the price of oil, which has spiked up recently. That, I think, what's happening in the oil market currently is probably more kind of immediate and local concerns, or sort of time immediate concerns, than it is sort of broadly this trade-off about fossil fuels. So the question is ask me the first question again. How do I see sort of the tension between the fact that we need to provide enough electricity now?
Yeah, today, 2021, while also, clearly we need to be investing very quickly in a lot of future technologies and getting that on board as well.
So, we can't stop producing with fossil fuel literally today, or the lights would go out. But we would have the ability to make the transition pretty quickly with the right incentives and with the right kind of public policy. So I mentioned the clean energy standard, which is probably not going to make it into the infrastructure bill, was exactly a bill that gave electricity companies carrots and sticks, rewards if they switched 4% of their generation capacity from fossil fuel to renewables, every year, and a stick if they missed that target, right? That's explicitly something that says, let's create the incentive and help cover some of the cost if necessary, create the incentives in order to switch over to renewables, which are now increasingly cost competitive. So how do I see the tension? I don't see there as being that much of a tension in the sense that, yes, of course we can't stop producing with fossil fuel today, but there's no reason we can't.
Uh-oh, I'm not hearing you right now. I'm not hearing Megan. Is everybody else hearing Megan?
just not hearing Megan as well. Megan, maybe check the connection on your headphones.
Oh, I think I hear you. Yes.
There, am I back?
Yes, you're back. You're back.
Sorry, I finished by saying that I saw the main tension is being between political decision makers who have interest in the entrenched interest of fossil fuels, and that's actually the main thing that is holding us back from having the policies that would encourage the kind of technical switching over that could happen.
This is a kind of interesting one. You mentioned greenwashing as something we want to avoid. What are your thoughts on ESG scoring? So environmental, social, governmental ratings on firms' pro-social activities. Do you think this could be an effective way of encouraging more sustainable practices in industry, or do you see it more as PR greenwashing?
So I know more about the E, the environmental, than I know about the S and the G, right? So let me talk about sort of the E part of ESG. I think the weakness of ESG scoring is that, to the extent that the system is sort of a system of check boxes, do you do this, yes or no, right? Can you do a token thing and sort of check the checkbox? ESG scoring doesn't necessarily reflect always very well whether the changes that the firm has made are important, right? Are a big change, are have materially affected what the firm's environmental footprint is. And so what you want is a system. In some sense, what you want is something that actually reports outcomes in terms of what carbon emissions are, or something that's measurable and reportable on the outcome that you actually care about, rather than something that gives sort of a long generic list of check boxes and sort of how many boxes can you check. So so can transparency help and sort of real reporting help? Yes. Is current ESG reporting always accomplish that? Not always.
Sounds like marching orders for the industry. This is a pretty popular one as well. What is it going to take to get international agreement on the plan to reduce greenhouse gases? And in particular, what can we do to get smaller developing countries on board with this? Should larger economies give new technologies to other countries for free so they can catch up without having to go through their own carbon to electric transition?
Yes, in many cases, my guess is that sharing technologies would help us in the long run. What would help? So we have the problem. So the question, especially when you think about developed countries versus less developed countries, is fundamentally a disagreement on what the right benchmark is. So it is developed countries' advantage to choose some year, whether it's 1990 or 2000 or 2005 or 2010, and say, let's all agree that those are our benchmark emissions and everybody should reduce by some symmetric amount. Why does that advantage the developed countries? Because we've already reached a state in development where we've built a whole bunch of things, and we've in some sense set our yardstick or our benchmark at a pretty high rate of emissions per capita that helps preserve our quality of life, in a way that a country that has developed more slowly or more recently has not reached that level of wealth, and would be sort of committing them, if they had to reduce from the same benchmark year, to always having to have a lower CO2 per person emissions, right? In some sense is forcing less developed countries to have to be more aggressive than the more developed countries are, just because the more developed countries develop first. what less developed countries want is more like some kind of an agreement that says, a long-term development objective is so and so many, tons of CO2 per person per year, and that's what should be normalized. And therefore, big countries should have to do more in terms of cutting back. Big developed countries should have to do more in terms of cutting back. And it has been fundamentally this disagreement that has upset climate negotiations before. So this is what upset the Kyoto negotiations, was that the U.S. wasn't willing to sort of agree to this way of looking at things. So it's an interesting question about sort of what should developed countries do to get less developed countries on board. I think developed countries need to think about what it is they're asking less developed countries to do. What is a reasonable request that allows those countries to achieve a standard of living that is reasonable to aspire to, and what larger and more developed countries have the responsibility to do given their own histories.
That's very interesting. I'd never heard it put quite so succinctly before about the difference between this kind of per capita versus year benchmark. So thank you for that.
And if you can't agree on that, it's hard to, if you fundamentally can't agree on that, then it's hard to then begin agreeing on an implementation, because you're literally just not agreeing about what's fair and what the objective is to start with.
So we're running out of time. I'm gonna end with a moonshot of a question, if that doesn't give it away completely. So you mentioned carbon sequestration technology, or technology that kind of removes greenhouse gases from the atmosphere, as something that currently right now is maybe not like the thing to hang our global hopes on. Are there any moonshot technologies that you see as, an answer for the situation we're currently finding ourselves in, or is that kind of the problem, that we keep expecting one of them to emerge?
If a genie appeared and said, you can have two things you want for the environment and for global climate change, what would it be? I would choose an effective global carbon price and green hydrogen to be at scale and cost effective. Maybe someday we will need carbon renewal, but what I want at the moment is to be able to reduce our emissions enough in the near term, in the immediate term, that we can see that our civilization gets a chance to need those future carbon renewal storage, the carbon renewal systems. And therefore, what I would most wish is the technologies that will give us a chance to be able to do those things in the long run.
Thank you so much. We are at time. Thank you to everyone for attending and for asking such really interesting questions. And a huge thank you to you, Professor Meghan Busse. We will send everyone a link to the video of this talk in about 24 hours. And of course, we'll be back next on December 2nd with another webinar with Professor Lee Thompson on best practices in navigating work relationships in a virtual world. Thank you so much.